Why atheism cannot be true. In this video, I'm going to mount an argument from rational certainty. The argument from rational certainty is a transcendental argument for the existence of God. It begins with a basic observation, not about the physical world, but about our rational experience. I'm going to posit that we possess rational certainty. Now, proviso, I know some people deny that we can possess or that we do possess rational certainty, but I would certainly like to point out that that's not how anyone actually lives in this real world. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think you don't have rational certainty, things like you can know that if you add 2 plus 2, it equals 4, then I would recommend you treat your relationship with your bank without rational certainty and see how far you will get. Denying rational certainty is like denying reality. From that single fact, it shows that such certainty requires an all-knowing mind to ground it. How so, I hear you say? If there is no all-knowing mind, we like to call that God, and I'm going to posit that that's the only rational way to call it, but let's leave that aside for the moment. If there is no all-knowing mind, one that has defined what is objectively true and what is objectively false, then we cannot have certainty that anything at all is true or false. You're not convinced? Stay with me. My contention is simply this. Any worldview that denies the existence of such a mind, i.e. God, and that of course is predominantly the case with those who profess to be atheists, collapses into a contradiction. So my argument is structured as follows. In part 1, I will give an introduction to the argument and provide, if you like, a brief overview. And then I will proceed to give a detailed justification for each premise I will make. And then I will summarize each justification and conclude. So the argument is structured in a deductive sense. In other words, by logical reason, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and so on. And if each premise is true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. It's, of course, sometimes true that premises are true, but the conclusion doesn't follow from them. So if each premise is true and the conclusion naturally follows from the premises, then the argument stands as true in itself. So the argument is basically as follows. Premise 1, rational certainty exists. Now, I'm just summarizing them here. I'm going to get into much more detail shortly. Premise 2, rational certainty requires a necessary precondition, and that necessary precondition is an all-knowing mind or an all-knowing God. Premise 3, any worldview that denies this necessary precondition cannot account for rational certainty without falling into a contradiction. Premise 4, atheism is a worldview that denies the existence of such a mind, i.e. they deny the existence of God. Premise 5, therefore atheism entails a contradiction at its core. It depends on rational certainty because, of course, the atheist claims to be able to do things like maths and science, which rely, as we shall see, or which are based on having rational certainty. So atheism, the contradiction that atheism entails is that it depends on rational certainty while denying the precondition that makes rational certainty even possible. It's like sawing off the plank that you're standing on. Premise 6, a worldview that entails a contradiction cannot be true. And as I said, we'll get into the meat of each of these. Conclusion, therefore atheism cannot be true and is necessarily false. Justifications. So I'm giving now a justification for premise 1. Rational certainty exists. Now, intuitively, we all know that rational certainty exists, but I'm going to mount an argument as to why this is the case. To begin, we must define what we mean by rational certainty. Rational certainty is not the mere feeling of confidence or even a strong belief. It is the ontological possession of knowledge of the kind that cannot be mistaken. And of course, we can have knowledge that can be wrong, but then there can be knowledge that cannot be mistaken. And this is what we're talking about, rational certainty. Notice here, I'm not just talking about any kind of knowledge. I'm talking about knowledge that must be true and then in fact cannot be wrong. Rational certainty is when someone knows something in such a way that the possibility of being wrong is excluded. We might encounter rational certainty in truths like mathematics or logic. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Or that a thing cannot be both itself and not itself at the same time and in the same respect. Another example is the statement, I exist. To deny your own existence requires your existence in order to make the denial. These truths, therefore, we appear to know with rational certainty. In other words, they cannot be false. Now consider someone who tries to deny that rational certainty exists. That denial faces the same problem as denying truth itself. If someone says truth does not exist, they are making a truth claim in the very act of denying the truth does not exist. They are saying it is true that truth does not exist, which is a contradiction, because truth has to exist in order for someone to claim that it does not exist. Likewise, the person who says rational certainty does not exist is attempting to make a claim that would have to be supported by rational certainty in order to be meaningful. If they are not rationally certain of the claim, rational certainty does not exist, then it is just an arbitrary assertion with no epistemic weight. In other words, it's a meaningless, arbitrary assertion. But if they are rationally certain of their denial of rational certainty, as you can obviously see, that's a contradiction. In other words, to meaningfully deny rational certainty is to presuppose it. Without rational certainty, there is no justification for the claim. You are simply expressing a belief, not demonstrating anything. So the only way to argue that rational certainty does not exist is to use rational certainty to do it, which is self-contradictory. Therefore, rational certainty is inescapable. It exists in the same way that truth exists as a necessary precondition for any kind of thought, reasoning, or argument. To deny it is to assume it. Premise 2. Rational certainty requires a necessary precondition, an all-knowing mind to ground universal and necessary truths. Before we defend this premise directly, it is important to explain the kind of reasoning being used here. This is transcendental reasoning, which is not the same as circular reasoning. Circular reasoning occurs when someone assumes the very thing they are trying to prove without providing any external justification. It is reasoning in a circle claiming X is true because X is true, which offers no independent grounds for said belief. But the transcendental reasoning is different. It asks a deeper question. What must be true in order for something else to be possible or actual? It does not assume the conclusion. Instead, it explores possible worlds and looks at which conditions must exist in order for certain features of reality to exist or be true. For example, this will be, I think, something that will be easy to understand. If electricity cannot exist unless electrons exist, then in any possible world where electrons do not exist, electricity would not be possible. In other words, electrons are a necessary precondition for the possibility of electricity. If you imagine a world without electrons, it logically follows that there could be no electricity in that world. Or take the case of rationality. Rationality is something that minds do. If you imagine a possible world in which no minds exist, then rationality could not exist in that world either. Therefore, minds are a necessary precondition for the possibility of rationality. From that it follows that if rationality exists, then minds necessarily must exist also. So notice, this is not circular reasoning. It is just recognizing that different kinds of possible worlds produce different kinds of outcomes depending on what conditions are initially present. A world without minds cannot give rise to rational thought, just like a world without electrons cannot give rise to electricity. However, just because one thing is necessary for another to exist, that does not mean it is the only necessary thing. In many cases, multiple preconditions must be in place for something else to be possible. Example: in order for electricity to exist in any world, that world must contain electrons, as we just saw. But it is not enough on its own. The world must also contain space, because electrons must have the ability to move, which creates the electricity. If a world contained no spatial dimension at all, then electrons could not move and electricity could not occur. There are at least two necessary preconditions for electricity to exist: electrons and space. Now, of course, there are probably more. This is just an example. In the same way, there are at least two necessary preconditions for rational certainty to exist. The first is that there must at least be one mind, and the second, and this is the core justification of my premise, and the second is that there must be an all-knowing mind. Now you might be thinking, how so? Well, this is the core of, or if you like, the meat of my argument. To possess rational certainty is to know something in such a way that it cannot be false. In other words, we know that 2 and 2 is 4, and it cannot be otherwise. So we possess rational certainty about some things. Of course, we don't possess rational certainty about a lot of things, because a lot of things are simply our subjective feelings. But there are lots of things that we possess rational certainty over. But in order for that to be so, some things must be true. It is to hold a belief, so rational certainty is to behold a belief that is not just subjectively convincing. In other words, I may not like vegan food for argument's sake, and that may be convincing to some and others not. But it must be objectively immune to error in order for it to be rational certainty. In order for us to have any rational certainty over it. However, for a finite mind, and this is the point, for a finite mind, that kind of certainty is impossible to guarantee, because a finite mind does not have access to all truth. Because a finite mind is finite. That mind's knowledge, as in this is, of course, we're talking about me and you, human beings. We are finite beings. We do not have all knowledge. Even though we do have rational certainty, we don't have all knowledge. We don't have access to all truth. So the question is, how can we be certain about something that we don't know doesn't exist? And this is the crux of the matter. Because a finite mind is finite, that mind's knowledge will always necessarily be limited. And in that limitation creates the constant possibility that something unknown could overturn what it currently believes. For example, imagine a person who's absolutely convinced that 2 plus 2 equals 4. On the surface, this appears to be rational certainty. But suppose that they have lived their entire life in a controlled environment where everyone around them is part of an elaborate deception, and all their teachers and materials have reinforced this claim as part of a long-running prank. Of course, this is an arbitrary example. I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that that is true. Because they lack full knowledge of their situation, they are unaware that their certainty is based on a falsehood. Of course, it's not. I'm just saying that it could be. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but bear with me for a moment. Imagine someone who confidently believes they have constructed a sound logical argument. However, their reasoning contains a subtle but critical flaw that they are unable to detect. Now, it's not just that they momentarily don't see it, they are actually unable to detect this flaw. Perhaps they misunderstood a key term, overlooked an invalid reference. Because they do not have access to the full range of facts and sufficient logical training, they are unaware of the error. Their mind gives them a sense of certainty, but that certainty is misplaced because it rests on faulty reasoning they cannot perceive. This is sort of the scenario that the film The Matrix posited. A person believes they have a family, a job, a personal history, but in reality they are a brain in a vat receiving electrical signals that simulate those experiences. Because they do not know what they do not know, their sense of certainty is misplaced. In all of these cases, the common factor is that the individual is not all-knowing. His finite knowledge has limits. Because they lack complete knowledge, they are unable to eliminate the possibility that their belief is false. This is what we call rational uncertainty. Rational uncertainty is the condition of not possessing rational certainty. It is the state in which a mind holds a belief that feels justified, but which could still be false, because it cannot rule out the possibility of unknown information that would overturn it. A finite mind, by definition, is not aware of all that is real. There are always facts or realities it does not know, and because it does not know what it does not know, it is always exposed to possible defeaters, that is, unknown truths that could possibly prove its current beliefs wrong. Therefore, if all minds are finite, which is in a material matter only, matter and energy only world that is posited by the atheist. Of course, all humans are finite minds. Then so if that is the case, then all minds are necessarily rationally uncertain. No finite mind can ever rule out the possibility that it is wrong, because no finite mind is all-knowing. There is also the chance that something outside of his awareness could overturn what it believes to be true. In a world where only finite minds exist, rational certainty would be impossible. The only thing that would be possible is rational uncertainty. This means that the only way rational certainty can exist, if at least one mind exists that knows all things and cannot be mistaken. Such a mind would not be vulnerable to being overturned by unknown facts, because there would be no unknown facts to this mind. It would have exhaustive access to everything in reality. This means it would be rationally certain by nature. Moreover, such a mind could serve as the foundation for rational certainty in finite minds like ours. Through revelation or some form of communication, an all-knowing mind could impart truth in a way that secures rational certainty within finite minds. This means that a finite mind does not need to become omniscient to have rational certainty. It only needs to receive truth from a source that cannot be wrong. Therefore, in order for rational certainty to be possible, the existence of an all-knowing mind is necessary. In other words, a necessary precondition for rational certainty. Premise 3. Any worldview that denies this necessary precondition, an all-knowing mind or God, cannot account for rational certainty without accepting a contradiction. At this point in the argument, we have established that that rational certainty exists, and that in order for it to be possible in any possible world, that world must contain an all-knowing mind. In other words, that world must have God in it. Rational certainty, by its very nature, requires access to all truth, which only an omniscient mind could possess. Finite minds, no matter how confident they may feel, can only possess rational uncertainty unless given rational certainty by an all-knowing mind. Now consider the kind of worldview that denies the existence of such a mind. Any worldview that does not include an all-knowing mind as part of its metaphysical structure is by definition a worldview in which only finite minds exist. But we have shown that finite minds alone cannot produce rational certainty. And yet we all experience and know intuitively that rational certainty exists. We've demonstrated this to be so. Therefore, any worldview that rejects the existence of an all-knowing mind, in other words, a worldview that rejects God, eliminates the very condition that makes rational certainty possible. To illustrate this, return to the analogy we've already used. In order for electricity to be possible, a world must contain electrons, but it must also contain space. Without space, electrons cannot move and electricity cannot occur. So if a worldview claimed that electricity exists, but also claimed that space does not exist, i.e., a world claims we have rational certainty, but a world claims that God does not exist, in other words, an all-knowing mind, then that would be a metaphysical contradiction. It would affirm a consequence while denying a necessary precondition. The same is true here. If rational certainty is only possible in a world where an all-knowing mind exists, then any worldview that affirms rational certainty while denying such a mind is incoherent. It is affirming a consequence while denying the very thing that makes that consequence possible. That is a contradiction. Contradictions are necessarily false because they assert what cannot logically or metaphysically coexist. A worldview that affirms what it also denies is not merely incomplete, it is broken at its core. Therefore, any worldview that denies the existence of an all-knowing mind must be false. It is logically and metaphysically self-defeating. Just as it would be contradictory to say electricity exists in a world with no space, it is contradictory to say rational certainty exists in a world with no all-knowing mind. It cannot be the case. Rational certainty is only possible in a world where an all-knowing mind exists. And it is the very reason why many atheists draw the conclusion that rational certainty doesn't exist. But that, of course, denies the very own reality of our existence. Premise 4, atheism is a worldview that denies the existence of such a mind, as in that denies God. Having now established that rational certainty requires the existence of an all-knowing mind, we must ask, does atheism allow for such a mind to exist? The answer is no. Atheism, by definition, is the belief that there is no God. It asserts that there is no transcendent, necessary, all-knowing mind who created and sustains the universe. In most cases, atheism is coupled with the metaphysical naturalism, which is the view that reality is exhausted, as in that's all there is, by physical processes and material causes, as in matter and energy is everything. Minds on this view are the products of biological evolution, temporary configurations of matter that emerge within complex brains. But if that is the case, then every mind in existence under atheism is finite, contingent, and fallible. No mind in that framework has access to all truth. No mind can know everything or guarantee the truth of its beliefs without the possibility of error. In short, atheism entails a world in which all minds are finite and limited. Now, if an atheist were to say that they believe an all-knowing mind does exist, they would, of course, naturally, in effect, be conceding the existence of God while simply be refusing to use the word. To affirm that there is a mind that knows all things, that cannot be wrong, and that exists necessarily outside of the limitations of space and time and finitude, is to describe what all classical theists mean by God. To say that such a mind exists, but it is not God, is absurd. If a being has the essential attributes of God, then that being is God. The label does not change the reality. So the atheist cannot grant that an all-knowing mind exists without abandoning atheism. They must deny that such a mind exists at all. And in doing so, they remove the very foundation that makes rational certainty possible. Atheists may attempt to avoid this implication by redefining God or by appealing to abstract entities such as logic or mathematics as eternal impersonal truths. But none of these alternatives provide the personal all-knowing mind that rational certainty requires. Laws of logic cannot think, reason, or reveal truth. They are not minds. And abstract impersonal realities cannot serve as the ground for rational knowledge in personal minds. Therefore, atheism directly entails the denial of the very precondition that rational certainty depends on. It is not just that atheism fails to include God as a possibility. It rules out the existence of the only kind of being that could ground rational certainty in the first place. In other words, it rules out the very precondition that allows them to even raise the argument to say that they're trying to rule God out. Premise 5. Therefore, atheism entails a contradiction. It depends on rational certainty while denying the precondition that makes rational certainty possible. At this stage of the argument, we've established that rational certainty exists, that it requires an all-knowing mind in order to be possible, and that atheism denies the existence of such a mind. What follows from these premises is that atheism is internally contradictory. It makes use of rational certainty while denying the necessary foundation that makes rational certainty possible. This leads to what is known as radical skepticism, which is what I mentioned before. Radical skepticism is the position that no one can have knowledge or certainty about anything. It is the view that all beliefs are ultimately unjustified and that truth is inaccessible and that we cannot trust even our most basic reasoning faculties. Atheism, by denying the existence of an all-knowing mind, leaves us with nothing but finite minds, minds that are necessarily subject to rational uncertainty. Without a perfect mind to ground truth, all knowledge becomes tentative and the result is radical skepticism. But as we have shown in premise 1, radical skepticism is false. Let's remember, the denial of rational certainty is self-defeating. To claim that we cannot be rationally certain of anything is to express rational certainty about our lack of it. This is a contradiction. At least one rational certainty must exist, or else the claim there is no rational certainty would collapse under its own weight. Therefore, rational certainty is transcendentally true. It cannot be denied without being affirmed. This creates a contradiction within atheism. If atheism is true, and then there is no all-knowing mind, and therefore rational certainty is impossible, but rational certainty exists, the atheist is therefore left claiming both that rational certainty does not and does exist at the same time, which is a contradiction. Premise 6. A worldview that entails a contradiction cannot be true. This premise is one of the most basic principles in all of logic, reason, and metaphysics. It is known as the law of non-contradiction, and it states that a proposition cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same respect. If a belief system or worldview leads to a contradiction, if it requires affirming that something is both is and is not, then it must be rejected as false. This is not a rule we arbitrarily impose. It is a law that makes reason itself possible. If contradictions could be true, then nothing could be trusted. Logic would collapse, disagreement would be meaningless, argument and evidence would have no purpose. A worldview that affirms contradiction cannot distinguish between truth and falsehood because it treats them as the same thing. Contradiction is not just an imperfection, it is a logical impossibility. It is to affirm what is false is true and what is true is false, simultaneously. And in any worldview that leads to such a result refutes itself. It cannot be accepted, no matter how appealing its conclusions might seem, because it undermines the very foundation of truth. In the previous premise, we demonstrated that atheism entails a contradiction. It requires affirming rational certainty in practice while denying the necessary precondition for rational certainty in theory. It simultaneously claims that rational certainty exists and cannot exist. This is not a paradox or mystery. It is a direct logical contradiction. And because contradictions cannot be true, any worldview that leads to one, such as atheism, cannot be true either. Conclusion: therefore, atheism cannot be true and is necessarily false. Let's summarize the argument and bring it to its conclusion. In premise 1, we demonstrated that rational certainty must necessarily exist. Rational certainty is the state in which a mind knows something in such a way that it cannot possibly be false. To deny rational certainty is self-defeating, because even the claim that rational certainty does not exist would itself require rational certainty in order to be meaningful. You would have to be rationally certain in order to justify the claim that no one can be rationally certain. The very act of denying it presupposes it. In premise 2, we showed that rational certainty depends on two necessary preconditions. First, there must be at least one mind, because rational certainty is a rational state, and rationality is something that only minds can do. A world without minds would not contain rational certainty. But that alone is not enough. The second necessary precondition is the existence of an all-knowing mind. This is because finite minds are always vulnerable to error. They are subject to rational uncertainty by nature, since they cannot know what they do not know. Only an all-knowing mind could possess rational certainty in any ultimate and infallible way, and only such a mind could serve as the source or ground of rational certainty for other minds. Premise 3. We showed that any worldview that denies this necessary precondition cannot account for rational certainty without a contradiction. If rational certainty requires an all-knowing mind, then any worldview that rejects the existence of such a mind is left affirming an effect while denying its cause. This is a metaphysical contradiction. In premise 4, we pointed out that atheism is exactly such a worldview. By definition, atheism denies the existence of God and therefore denies the existence of any all-knowing mind. The atheist cannot appeal to such a being without abandoning atheism in principle, and attempts to replace that mind with impersonal abstractions like logic or mathematics fail because they are not minds and cannot reveal truth. Premise 5. We showed that this leads directly to radical skepticism, the view that nothing can be known without certainty. Atheism, by denying the precondition for rational certainty, collapses into radical skepticism. But we have already shown that radical skepticism is false because rational certainty is transcendentally necessary. Therefore, atheism leads to a contradiction. It affirms and denies rational certainty at the same time. In premise 6, we restated that any worldview that entails contradictions cannot be true. This is a basic law of reason. Therefore, the conclusion follows necessarily. Atheism cannot be true and is necessarily false. I hope that helped you understand. And if you're an atheist listening, I hope that you will do more research, you will do more reading and have some deep thinking about this whole matter. And if you're a Christian, I hope that you were encouraged in your Christian belief. And I would strongly recommend to use this argument, because I think it is, to me, one of the most convincing arguments for God, outside of all the evidence we have in that sense, historically and biblical evidence. It is the most, I think it is an argument that is inarguably true, and is also really quite easy to understand, and therefore a great tool in your attempts to evangelize the lost.